He married her to save her from hanging, but never expected to fall in love. The sun was a cruel eye in the pale Montana sky, baking the dust of the town square to a fine choking powder. On the raw timber of the gallows she stood. Her name was Elara, a name the town spat out like a curse. Her dress was frayed, her hands bound, but her chin was lifted, her eyes fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mountains, as if the jeering crowd below was nothing more than buzzing flies. They said she'd killed a man, a wealthy landowner found dead in his study. They had found her there, holding a letter opener slick with his blood. Her trial was a formality, a quick stamp on a foregone conclusion. Now, the rope swayed in the hot, still air, a patient serpent. From the edge of the crowd, Elias Thorne watched. He was a man carved from silence and shadow, a former marshal who had turned in his badge years ago, trading the town's hypocrisy for the honest solitude of his ranch. He had come for supplies, not for a spectacle of public death. Yet, he could not look away. He saw not the murderer the preacher condemned, but the defiant tremor in her jaw, the untamed wilderness in her eyes that matched the land he called home. He saw the way the light caught the few clean strands of her dark hair, and the way her knuckles were white where her hands were bound, a small sign of the terror she refused to show. The crowd was a beast, hungry and mindless, feeding on her fear. They shouted taunts, their faces twisted into masks of self-righteous fury. A woman in a fine bonnet pointed and hissed, "Devil's spawn!" A man threw a rotten vegetable that splattered near her feet. Through it all, she remained still, a solitary island in a sea of hate. Elias felt a familiar cold anger stir in his gut. It was the same anger that had made him turn his back on this town, on the so-called justice that was so often just a prettier name for vengeance. The hangman, a portly man with sweat stains under his arms, adjusted the noose with a practiced air that made Elias's stomach turn. The sheriff, a self-important man named Miller, cleared his throat and unrolled a scroll to read the final sentence. In that suffocating pause, that moment where a life hung suspended by a thread of time, Elias moved. His steps were quiet but heavy, parting the crowd like a stone dropped in water. Men who had been jeering a moment before fell silent as he passed, their eyes following him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He stopped at the base of the gallows, his shadow falling long and dark across the dusty ground. "Sheriff." His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Miller squinted down, his face turning a blotchy red. "What foolishness is this, Thorne? This is official business." "There's a law," Elias stated, his voice flat, betraying no emotion. "The Matrimonial Provision Act of '68, an old territorial statute, but it's still on the books." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. "A man can claim a condemned woman for his wife," Elias continued. "Her sentence is commuted to his custody. Her life becomes his responsibility." The sheriff gaped. "You'd marry a killer?" "I'll marry a life," Elias corrected, his gaze finally lifting to meet Elara's. For the first time, her defiant mask faltered, a flicker of raw, stunned disbelief crossing her features. He saw her then, not as a symbol, but as a person, cornered and condemned. He would not let the wilderness in her eyes be extinguished by the town's petty vengeance. Without waiting for a response, he started up the wooden steps. He stood before her, the hangman, and the preacher. "Do it," he said. The ceremony was a grim, hurried affair, the words of sacrament, a stark contrast to the noose still dangling beside them. He was pronounced her husband. He untied her hands himself, his calloused fingers brushing her skin. He led her down from the gallows, through the stunned, silent crowd, and toward his waiting wagon. a man who had just bound himself to a ghost, a woman who had been given a life she never asked for from a man she did not know. The ride to his homestead was a study in silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the lonesome sigh of the wind across the vast, empty plains. Elara sat stiffly on the bench, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. She stared straight ahead at the endless horizon, her face a stone mask, refusing to look at the man beside her, the stranger who now legally owned her life. The world had shrunk to the space of this wagon, to the suffocating proximity of this silent, formidable man. She could feel the heat of his body, the solid presence of him, and it was both a comfort and a terror. He was her saviour and her jailer, a paradox she couldn't begin to unravel. Her mind was a maelstrom of shock and fear. The feeling of the rope on her neck, though it had never touched her, was a phantom sensation, a cold burn that wouldn't fade. She had been ready for death, had braced herself for the final drop into nothingness. She had not been prepared for this strange, uncertain continuation. Elias did not speak either. He kept his eyes on the trail, a trail he knew so well he could have travelled it in his sleep. His hands were firm and capable on the reins, his profile as rugged and unforgiving as the landscape they moved through. The sun bled across the sky, painting the high, thin clouds in hues of orange and bruised purple, casting long skeletal shadows from the sparse pines and weathered rock formations. He had not done it for her, he told himself, the thought a repeating mantra to ward off the complexity of his own actions. He had done it for a principle, for the memory of a law that valued life, however flawed, over the bloodlust of a mob. It was a final act of defiance against the town he despised, a last echo of the marshal he once was. She was a problem, a complication he had not sought, a presence that would shatter the careful, quiet world he had built around his grief. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She was so still, so contained. She looked like a porcelain doll, beautiful and fragile, but he knew that was a lie. He had seen the fire in her eyes on the gallows, the spirit that had refused to be broken. That was what had called to him, that flicker of untamed life. It reminded him of a wild mare he had once tried to break, a creature that would rather die than be tamed. He had let that horse go free. This one he had just shackled to himself. When they finally arrived, the last light of day was fading, and the valley was sinking into a deep pool of shadow. His ranch was a lonely outpost clinging to the edge of a wide, desolate basin, cradled by dark, brooding mountains. A simple log cabin, a sturdy barn, and a few corrals were the only marks of human life for miles. It was a place built for forgetting, a fortress of solitude. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal, careful not to startle her. He led her to the cabin door, which groaned on its leather hinges as he pushed it open. "The loft is yours," he said, his voice rough, unused to conversation. He pointed to a sturdy ladder leading to the upper level. "There's a bed, and water in the basin. You'll be safe here." She glanced at him, her eyes dark and unreadable in the twilight. Safe. She had not felt safe a single day in her life. The word was foreign, a language she did not speak. It sounded like another kind of cage. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, a flicker of acknowledgement, and climbed the ladder to the loft without a word. Her movements were stiff, like an automaton. He watched her go, a slender silhouette against the dying light, before turning to tend to the horses, the familiar task a welcome anchor in the surreal current of the day. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a profound, echoing loneliness. From the loft, Elara looked around the small space that was to be her new prison. A simple cot with a neatly folded blanket, a small table with a wash basin and a pitcher, and a single small window that looked out onto the immense dark wilderness. It was clean, Spartan, the home of a man who expected nothing and wanted even less. She sank onto the cot, the tension of the day finally overwhelming her. Her body began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder. She clutched the small, cool object hidden in the secret pocket of her dress, a silver locket. It was the only thing she had left of her past, a tangible link to a world that now seemed a distant dream. She did not know what this new life held, but as she listened to the wind begin to howl outside, a mournful sound that seemed to speak her own desolation, she knew one thing for certain. She had traded one gallows for another, and survival was a battle she would have to fight all over again, alone. The first week passed in a tense, unspoken truce, a fragile peace negotiated in the currency of silence. Elara rose before dawn each day, the chill of the loft seeping into her bones long before the sun had even thought of cresting the eastern mountains. She moved through the cabin with a ghostly quietness, learning the creaks of the floorboards, the sighs of the old log walls. She stoked the fire, boiled water for coffee she wasn't sure he wanted, and swept the rough-hewn floorboards with a makeshift broom. She did not do it for him, not. Really, she did it for herself, to impose a simple physical routine on the swirling chaos of her mind. It was an act of defiance, a way to claim a small piece of this space, to prove to herself and to the silent man below that she was not just a burden he had shouldered, a piece of property he had acquired. In her explorations of the small homestead, she found a neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, its soil cracked and hard, choked with weeds. With a rusty trowel she discovered half buried in the barn, she began to turn the earth. The work was punishing. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labour, quickly blistered and bled. But she didn't stop. She worked until her palms were raw, and her back ached with a fire that was almost welcome, for it drowned out the other, colder fires within her. Her movements were methodical, fierce. A silent war waged against the barrenness of the land and the barrenness of her own hope. Among the tangled weeds and dry roots, she discovered a single withered rosebush, its branches thorny and black, seemingly dead beyond revival. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to rip it out. Instead, she cleared the weeds from its base, loosened the soil, and gave it water from the pump. It was a small, irrational act of faith in a world that had given her no reason to believe in the resurrection of anything. Elias watched her from a distance. He would stand on the porch in the cool, grey light of dawn, a cup of strong black coffee steaming in his hands, and observe her as she toiled in the garden. He saw her slender frame silhouetted against the rising sun, a figure of grim determination. He had expected a cowering, broken creature, or perhaps a cunning manipulator, skilled in the arts of survival. He had not expected this quiet, ferocious resilience, this stubborn refusal to surrender. He saw the way she pushed through her own pain, the set of her jaw as she forced the trowel into the unyielding earth. It was the same defiance he had seen on the gallows, now channeled into a different kind of fight. He said nothing. He offered no help, no praise. Their interactions remained limited to the bare necessities, a choreography of avoidance. He would leave freshly hunted game or a sack of flour on the porch. She would cook it and leave a plate of food for him on the simple wooden table. They were two ghosts haunting the same space, their orbits carefully avoiding collision, each respecting the other's solitude, each wary of the other's secrets. One morning, as she headed out to the garden, her hands aching, she found a pair of thick leather work gloves lying on the porch steps. They were old and worn, but the leather had been softened with use, and they were small enough to fit her hands. There was no note, no explanation. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that they were from him. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she couldn't immediately name it. Gratitude? No, it was more complicated than that. It was a flicker of connection, a recognition that he saw her, that he acknowledged her struggle. She slipped them on, the leather a soft, protective shield against her skin, and for a fleeting moment, the crushing weight of her solitude lessened, just a fraction. Later that day, from the corner of her eye, she saw him by the corral, trying to mend a broken fence post. His movements were stiff and awkward. He favoured his left leg, she noticed, a subtle but persistent limp that he tried to conceal. She saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the deep, weary sadness that clung to him like a shroud, a sorrow that seemed to have settled into his very bones. She began to see the man behind the stoic facade, the cracks in his carefully constructed armour. That evening, after their silent meal, she left a small clay jar of herbed salve, something her mother had taught her to make for aches and pains, beside his empty plate. He did not acknowledge it when he cleared the table, but the next morning, through a crack in the loft floorboards, she saw him rubbing the fragrant green ointment into his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. A silent language was forming between them, a language of small gestures, of needs met without words, of hurts acknowledged without questions. A fragile bridge was being built across the chasm of their shared silence, one small, unspoken kindness at a time. The quiet of the homestead was not a peaceful one. It was a weighted quiet, thick with unspoken questions and past sorrows. Elara soon discovered the source of the deepest silence, the heart of the ranch's grief. It was a small, unmarked grave on a low hill that overlooked the cabin, a place where the wind always seemed to blow a little. Colder. A simple wooden cross, weathered to a silver grey by the sun and snow, was the only marker. She often found Elias standing there in the twilight, a solitary, unmoving figure, staring down at the mounded earth as if trying to will something back from it. His shoulders would be slumped, the iron control he maintained during the day gone, leaving him looking vulnerable and profoundly alone. She never asked who was buried there. She understood instinctively that some griefs were too sacred for words, too heavy to be disturbed. She learned the rhythms of his sorrow, just as she had learned the rhythms of the seasons. She knew that it deepened when the wind blew from the north, carrying the first chill of winter. She saw how his silence grew heavier on certain days, anniversaries of some unspoken loss that he marked alone. She continued her work in the garden, and to her astonishment, her irrational faith was rewarded. Tiny green shoots began to push their way through the dark soil. The beans sprouted, then the squash, and the dead rosebush, the one she had almost given up on, sprouted a single, pale green leaf, a small, defiant miracle. The garden became her sanctuary, the one place where she could cultivate life in the midst of so much desolation. It was proof that she could still make things grow, that she was not as barren as her circumstances. Elias, in turn, began to leave other things for her. One day, a new, sturdy handle for the rusty trowel appeared on the porch. A week later, a small sack of better quality seeds he'd procured from town was left by the door. Then, a freshly sharpened knife for the kitchen, its blade gleaming. Each item was an admission, a crack in the wall of his isolation, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, of her contribution to this place. He started watching her more openly, not with the detached curiosity of a warden, but with something akin to respect, even wonder. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the way she could predict the weather by the feel of the air or the colour of the sunset. He noticed the gentle way she spoke to the horses when she thought he wasn't around, her voice a low, soothing murmur that seemed to calm their most skittish tendencies. He realized she was not just resilient, she was deeply connected to the world around her, a part of the wilderness he so admired. One afternoon, a sudden violent downpour sent them both running for the cover of the barn. They stood in the wide open doorway, the rich, earthy scent of rain and wet hay filling the air, watching the storm lash the valley. It was the closest they had been in weeks, their shoulders almost touching in the cavernous space. "The creek will rise," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper against the drumming of the rain on the roof. He glanced at her, surprised she had spoken directly to him about something other than immediate necessity. "It always does," he replied, his voice gruff. "It will wash out the lower fence if it's not mended," she added, her gaze fixed on the churning, muddy water that was already beginning to spill over the banks of the normally placid stream in the distance. He followed her line of sight and nodded slowly. He had been so lost in his own world, in his work and his grief, that he hadn't noticed the fence posts were leaning, weakened by the spring thaw. "You have a sharp eye," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate on his tongue. She shrugged, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a gesture that was both protective and unconsciously graceful. "You learn to see the weak spots in things when you've lived around them your whole life," she said, and he knew she wasn't just talking about fences. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the world washed clean, glistening and smelling of life. The air between them had shifted, cleared by the storm as well. It was no longer just his homestead and his prisoner, his responsibility. A fragile sense of we had begun to take root, as tentative and as stubborn as the new life in her garden. A shared sense of place, a shared concern for its survival. The quiet was broken a week later by the sound of approaching horses, a sound that was not the familiar easy gait of a neighbour, but the heavy, deliberate tread of authority. 3 men rode into the yard, their faces hard, their saddles creaking with the weight of their rifles. Elara, who was by the water pump, recognized Sheriff Miller at the lead, his eyes sweeping over the property with a possessive, contemptuous sneer. She froze, the bucket slipping from her grasp, her heart a cold knot in her chest. The fragile peace she had begun to feel shattered into 1,000 pieces. Elias stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved. Without haste, his body a solid, unmovable presence blocking the doorway to the cabin. He wasn't wearing a gun, but his stance was as solid and unyielding as an old oak. "What do you want, Miller?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, the quiet tone more menacing than a shout. "Just a welfare check on my prisoner, Thorne," the sheriff said, dismounting with a theatrical groan. His 2 deputies remained on their horses, their hands resting near their holsters, their expressions a mixture of boredom and intimidation. "The good people of the town are concerned you're not keeping a proper eye on her. A murderess, after all." His gaze landed on Elara, full of a thick, oily contempt. "Looks like you've put her to work. Good, an idle woman is the devil's workshop." Elias didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. "She's not a prisoner," he said, his voice dropping a degree colder. "She's my wife, and this is my land. You have no jurisdiction here." The sheriff chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the nerves. "A wife you bought off the gallows. That ain't a marriage, Thorne. That's a leash. We just want to make sure the leash is tight." He took a swaggering step toward the porch, his hand moving toward his own sidearm. "Maybe we'll just have a look inside. Make sure she hasn't fashioned a shiv out of a spoon." Elias moved so quickly it was a blur of contained violence. In 2 long strides, he was off the porch, placing himself directly in the sheriff's path. His voice dropped further, losing its calm edge entirely and taking on the chilling authority of the lawman he used to be, the man who had faced down killers without blinking. "You are not welcome here, Miller," he said, each word a sharp, cold stone. "Your authority ended at the town line. You take one more step, and you'll be trespassing, and I deal with trespassers myself." The air crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. The deputies shifted uneasily in their saddles, their eyes darting from their boss to the silent, imposing figure of Elias Thorne. The sheriff was a bully, but he was not a fool. He knew Elias Thorne's reputation. He had seen the man in action years ago, in a saloon brawl that had left 3 men unconscious. And it was a memory that still commanded a fearful respect. He knew that the man before him was not the broken recluse the town whispered about. He was a sleeping wolf that had just been prodded awake. For a long, stretched moment, they stood locked in a battle of wills. The sheriff's face was flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He had come here to assert his power, and he was being stonewalled by a man he considered his inferior. Finally, realizing he had miscalculated, he spat on the ground near Elias's boots. "This ain't over, Thorne," he snarled, his voice a low hiss. "That snake will bite you one day. And when she does, I'll be the one to put her down for good." He spun on his heel, mounted his horse with a clumsy, angry motion, and rode away, his men trailing behind him like defeated dogs. Elias stood watching until they were nothing but a cloud of dust on the horizon. Then he turned, his shoulders slumping slightly as the adrenaline faded. His eyes found Elara. She was still standing by the pump, her body rigid, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fierce new light. He had defended her. He had called her his wife, and meant it not as a legal term, but as a boundary line drawn in the dirt, a declaration of allegiance. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not a void, but a shared space, a battlefield where they had stood together, back to back, and won. That night, a fragile peace settled over the valley, a peace made more precious by the threat that had just passed. The confrontation with the sheriff had changed something fundamental between them. It had been a public declaration, forging a reluctant alliance into something stronger, a sense that they were besieged by the same world and could only rely on each other. Later, as the moon rose, a perfect silver disk in a sea of stars, Elias found Elara on the small hill. She was standing before the weathered wooden cross, her silhouette a dark, slender shape against the vast, star-dusted sky. The wind gently stirred her hair, and for a moment she looked less like an outcast and more like a spirit of the land itself. He walked up the slope, his limp more pronounced in the cool night air, the ache in his leg a dull echo of older, deeper aches. He stopped beside her, not speaking for a long time, just sharing the silence and the immense, quiet beauty of the night. "His name was Samuel," he said finally, his voice low, seeming to be pulled from a great depth. She didn't look at him, her gaze remaining on the simple grave as if she'd known this confession was coming. "My brother, not my husband." Elara turned then, her eyes wide with surprise in the faint moonlight. The whole town, the whispers, the assumptions, all of it had been wrong. Elias gestured to the empty space beside the grave, a space that seemed to hold a palpable emptiness. "And that was my wife, Mary. We lost our first child, a girl, not long after she was born. The fever took her in a single night." The confession hung in the air between them, a raw, painful truth that he had kept locked away for years. "Mary, she followed a year later. Not from sickness, from a broken heart. She just faded. Gave up. I think the silence of this place became too loud for her." He looked out over the valley, his self-imposed exile. "I was the town marshal then," he continued, his voice low and bitter, laced with a self-recrimination that was still sharp. I could face down outlaws and killers, but I couldn't save my own family. I couldn't protect them from the quiet, invisible things that kill you. After Mary died, I couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes, the whispers behind their hands. So I turned in my badge and came out here. I thought silence would be a comfort. It isn't, Elara whispered, her voice filled with a profound understanding. It's just a different kind of loud. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw the echo of his own pain in her eyes, the same haunted look of someone who has lost everything. He saw a survivor, and for the first time, he didn't feel so alone in his grief. "Did you do it?" he asked, the question blunt, stripped of all judgment and accusation. It was a question born of a sudden, desperate need to know the truth, to bridge the final gap between them. "Did you kill that man?" She met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes, clear and steady in the moonlight, held no lie, no artifice. For a long, breathless moment she said nothing, as if weighing the risk of baring her soul. Then she shook her head once, a slow, deliberate movement that was more powerful than any protestation of innocence. And in that moment, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, Elias made a choice. He chose to believe her. It was a leap of faith, an act of trust in a woman he barely knew, a woman the world had condemned. But his gut, the instinct that had kept him alive for years as a lawman, screamed that she was speaking the truth. "The storm is coming," she said, her voice pulling him back to the present. He looked up. The stars were gone, obscured by a wall of thick, dark clouds rolling in from the west. The air had grown heavy, charged, electric. As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder echoed through the distant mountains, a deep, guttural warning. They were no longer just a man and a woman on a lonely ranch. They were two survivors, standing on a small patch of earth, about to be tested by the fury of the elements and the ghosts of their pasts, bound together by a shared understanding that was deeper than any vow. They hurried back to the cabin, the first drops of rain, cold and heavy as coins, beginning to fall, heralding the arrival of a storm that promised to be as violent as the emotions they had just unleashed. The wind began to howl, a mournful, angry sound that rattled the very bones of the small cabin. The storm broke over the valley with a breathtaking biblical ferocity. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, driven almost horizontally by the gale-force winds. Lightning ripped across the sky in jagged, incandescent tears, illuminating the world in stark, flashing tableaus of chaos, followed instantly by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the ground. The world outside was a churning nightmare of wind and water. A moment later, a sound like a giant's fist smashing wood echoed from the direction of the barn, a splintering groan that was audible even over the roar of the storm. "The roof," Elias muttered, his face grim as he grabbed a heavy oilskin coat and a lantern. He was already moving toward the door, his body tense with alarm. "Stay here." But Elara was right behind him, pulling her own thin coat over her shoulders, her eyes wide but determined. "The horses are in there. They'll be terrified." The wind nearly tore the door from their hands as they stepped outside into the maelstrom. It was like stepping into another world, a world of pure, elemental fury. They fought their way to the barn, leaning into the wind, the lantern light a tiny, fragile beacon in the overwhelming dark. Inside, the situation was dire. A massive, ancient oak tree that stood near the barn had been struck by lightning, one of its huge limbs crashing through the northern wall, shattering timbers and exposing the interior to the full force of the storm. A main support beam had cracked under the impact and was sagging precariously, groaning under the weight of the waterlogged roof. The horses were panicked, their eyes rolling white with terror. their frantic whinnies lost in the roar of the storm. One of them, a young spirited mare that Elias had been training, was trapped in her stall, a heavy fallen timber pinning her flank against the wall. As Elias moved to help the mare, his injured leg, the ground beneath him slick with mud and water, gave way. He went down with a sharp cry of pain, clutching his knee as a fresh wave of agony shot through him. He tried to rise, but the pain was too intense. He was helpless, a fact that galled him more than the pain itself. Elara didn't hesitate. While Elias struggled, she moved with a calm, focused intensity that seemed to defy the chaos around her. She was no longer the quiet, haunted woman from the loft. She was a force of nature in her own right. She grabbed a spare length of rope from a peg, her hands, though trembling, working quickly and expertly to tie a loop. She approached the terrified mare, not with force, but with a low, soothing voice, murmuring nonsense words that were more about tone than meaning. The mare, sensing her calm, quieted slightly, its panicked thrashing ceasing for a moment. Elara slipped the rope over the horse's head, then turned her attention to the fallen timber. It was heavy, far too heavy for her to lift alone. Her eyes scanned the debris-strewn barn and landed on a long iron pry bar leaning against a wall. Gritting her teeth, she dragged it over, wedged it under the beam, and used a stray block of wood as a fulcrum. She put all of her weight, all of her strength into it, her muscles screaming in protest. The beam lifted, just an inch, then two. It was enough. "Now!" she shouted to Elias over the din. He crawled forward, ignoring the fire in his leg, and with a surge of adrenaline, managed to pull the frightened, trembling mare free from the trap. Just as the horse scrambled to safety, the main support beam gave a final, sickening crack and collapsed completely, bringing a large section of the roof down with it in a terrifying cascade of splintered wood, shingles, and hay. They had made it out by a matter of seconds. Shaking and soaked to the bone, they huddled together in the safer southern part of the barn, the storm still raging outside, the sound of their own ragged breaths mingling with the wind. Elias stared at her in the flickering, unstable lantern light. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes were soaked through, but her eyes were blazing with life and fierce intelligence. He saw her, in that moment, as a complete person for the first time. She had not just survived, she had taken command. She had been fearless, capable, and brilliant. The woman he had rescued from the gallows had just, in every way that mattered, rescued him, his rescuer, his wife. Back inside the relative warmth and safety of the cabin, the storm outside seemed a distant, muffled echo. The fire crackled and hissed in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on their tired faces. Elara knelt on the floor, gently tending to Elias's injured knee. She had cut away the fabric of his soaked trousers with a sharp knife and was applying a fresh poultice of herbs with a touch that was both firm and surprisingly gentle. The scent of crushed willow bark and comfrey filled the small space. He watched her, his usual stoicism completely gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. The pain in his leg was a dull, persistent throb, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming turmoil in his chest. "You should have been a doctor," he said, his voice hoarse and quiet. She looked up from her work, her fingers pausing. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "My mother was a healer. She taught me some things. She said the most important part of healing was not the herbs, but the hands. You have to have a feel for the hurt." She went back to wrapping his knee with clean strips of linen, her movements efficient and sure. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared experience of the storm, the near disaster, and now, the quiet, profound intimacy of her care. "I was wrong about you," he said softly, the admission costing his pride a great deal. She finished tying the knot on the bandage and sat back on her heels, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Most people are. No, he insisted, leaning forward slightly, wincing as he moved. I thought I was giving you a sanctuary, a place to hide. But you're not the one who's been hiding. His confession hung in the air between them, as stark and as honest as the storm outside. It was he who had been hiding from the world, from his own life, barricaded behind the high walls of his grief. Elara's gaze softened. The time for silence, for secrets, was over. They said I killed him, she began, her voice low and steady, as if reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times in the dark to keep the truth alive. Mr. Abernathy. I was his wife's companion after she fell ill with consumption. He was a cruel man, a gambler, in debt to dangerous people from the city. One night, they came to collect. I was in my room, but I heard the shouting. There was a fight. He tried to blame his debts on me. He said I was stealing from him to pay a lover. When the sheriff arrived, he was dead, and I was the only one there. They found my fingerprints on the letter opener. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small, dented silver locket. She opened it and showed it to him. Inside was a miniature portrait of a kind-faced woman with Elara's eyes. This was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. He tried to take it from me that night, said it would be a down payment on what I owed him. That's why I had the letter opener. I was defending the only thing I had left in the world. Her story was simple, believable, and it fit the pieces of the puzzle he hadn't known were missing. The town had wanted a simple villain, a scapegoat, and a penniless woman with no connections was the easiest choice. He felt a surge of cold, righteous fury at the injustice of it all, followed by a wave of something else, something fiercely protective and tender. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand where it clutched the precious locket. I believe you, Elara. Her breath hitched, a small wounded sound, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw tears well in her eyes. Not tears of self-pity or fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It was one thing to survive, to endure. It was another thing entirely to be seen, to be believed. He saw the years of pain she had carried alone, the crushing weight of a lie that had almost cost her her life. He saw the incredible, luminous strength it had taken for her not to break, not to become the bitter, hateful creature the world had tried to make her. His heart, a thing he had thought long dead and buried on that lonely hill, ached with a feeling so powerful and so new it stole his breath. He had married her to save her from hanging, a cold legal act meant to satisfy a flicker of his old buried conscience. He had given her his name as a shield. But now, in the firelit quiet of his cabin, he knew he wanted to give her more. He wanted to give her his heart. He leaned forward, his gaze searching hers, asking a silent question that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with love. Her tears spilled over, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of homecoming. It was hesitant, gentle, a taste of salt from her tears and the promise of something new. It was the quiet, tender blooming of a rose in the most desolate of soils, a testament to the fact that even after the most violent storm, life and love could find a way to begin again. The emotional walls, once as high and as formidable as the mountains surrounding them, had crumbled to dust. In the warm, fire-lit cabin, with the storm still murmuring its spent fury outside, a new kind of quiet descended, one that was not empty, but full, rich with the weight of shared truths and new beginnings. Elias looked at Elara, truly seeing her not as a survivor or a mystery, but as the architect of his own salvation. Her face, smudged with dirt and illuminated by the flickering flames, was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He had lived so long in a grey world of memory and regret that the vibrant life in her felt like the sun returning after a long, hard winter. He gently pulled back from their kiss, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "For what?" she asked, her own voice a soft tremor. "For not seeing you sooner. For letting you live in the shadows of this place when all along you were the only light in it." She pulled back slightly, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. Her touch was a balm, a gentle absolution. "You saw me when no one else did, Elias. You saw me on that gallows when all anyone else saw was a murderer. You gave me a chance. You can't build a home in a day." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I don't want to just give you a home, Elara. I want to build one with you." He opened his eyes again, his gaze intense, honest, and full of a love that was as solid and as real as the ground beneath them. "I love you." The words, so simple, so long absent from his life, felt both strange and perfectly natural on his tongue. They were the truest thing he had said in years. Elara's heart, a thing she had guarded so fiercely for so long, felt as if it would overflow. The tears returned, but this time they were tears of joy, a cleansing rain washing away the last of the fear and the loneliness. "I love you too," she breathed. The words a release, a promise, a prayer answered. They didn't speak for a long time after that. There was nothing more that needed to be said. He helped her to her feet and then, using her as a crutch, limped towards the hearth. They sat on the worn bearskin rug before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They listened to the crackle of the logs and the steady rhythm of each other's breathing. It was a moment of perfect unadorned peace. The cabin, once a fortress of his grief, now felt like a sanctuary for them both. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they had receded, making room for a new, living presence. The spectre of her own past, the gallows and the judgment, seemed a distant, powerless nightmare. In the shelter of his arms, she finally felt what she had only read about in books, what she had thought was a lie told to hopeful girls. She was home. The storm outside had passed completely, and through the small cabin window, they could see the clouds parting, revealing a sky washed clean and brilliant with stars. It was a new world, a new day dawning in the middle of the night. Their life, their real life together, was just beginning, born not of law or necessity, but of a love that had grown, patient and tenacious, in the most unlikely of places. It was a love that had been tested by fire and flood, by malice and misunderstanding, and had emerged stronger, truer, and more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined. The years that followed were peaceful, settling over the valley like a soft, welcome rain after a long drought. The story of the standoff with Sheriff Miller became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the town's saloon about the day the ghost of Marshal Thorne returned to defend his home. People began to see Elias and Elara not as a recluse and his gallows bride, but as the quiet, formidable couple from the valley. Respect, once a foreign concept, grew, slow and steady, like the deep roots of an old tree. Miller, disgraced, eventually lost his position, and the town, without his poison, began to heal. The homestead flourished, the herd of cattle doubled, and the barn was filled with the sweet smell of hay and the soft sounds of livestock. Elara's garden became a wonder, a riot of colour and life that drew admirers from neighbouring ranches. They came for her knowledge of herbs, for her remedies for sick animals and sicker children, for the simple, profound peace that seemed to radiate from her. The name Elara, once a curse, was now spoken with affection and admiration. The unmarked grave on the hill was no longer a symbol of sorrow. Elara had planted a circle of crimson roses around it, and Elias had carved a new marker, a simple stone that read, Mary Thorne, beloved wife and mother, at peace. It was a place of memory now, not of mourning. Their love deepened with each passing season, a quiet, powerful force that needed few words. It was in the way he brought her a cup of coffee every morning, just the way she liked it. It was in the way she would gently massage his ailing knee by the fire at night. It was in the shared smiles, the easy silences, the complete and utter trust that had grown between them. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching their two young children, a boy with his father's steady eyes and a girl with her mother's wild spirit chase fireflies in the twilight, Elias reached for her hand. His was calloused and strong. Hers was slender and capable, and they fit together perfectly. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, her head resting on his shoulder. That day in the town square. He looked out at the darkening hills, at the children's laughter echoing in the warm air, at the life they had built from ashes. "Regret it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Elara, that was the first day of my life, the day I stopped being a ghost and started living again." He turned to her, his eyes full of a love so deep it was as vast and as endless as the Montana sky above them. "You didn't just save your own life that day," he whispered. "You saved mine too." She smiled, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. The woman who was meant to hang had found her home. The man who had lived with ghosts had found his heart. In a world that had condemned them both, they had found their own justice, their own peace, their own perfect, unconventional love. And as the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness, they sat together in the quiet contentment of a life hard won and deeply cherished, a testament to the enduring power of a love that refused to die. If you were moved by the story of a love that defied the gallows, a love that grew in the silence and bloomed in the face of injustice, then you have found your home here at Wild West Love Stories. We believe that the greatest romances are not the easy ones, but the ones forged in fire, the ones that heal the deepest wounds and prove that a person's true worth can never be judged by a prejudiced world. The story of Elias and Elara reminds us that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to truly save yourself. For more tales of resilient hearts, quiet heroes, and the untamed love that defined the American frontier, be sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and ring the bell so you never miss a moment of the passion and peril of the Old West. Thank you for riding with us, and we'll see you in the next story.